The protagonist looked tiredly at her hand, where a handful of pills now lay, and reflected on the fact that she had tolerated living in this horrible world for 3 whole years. But that was her limit. And so she decided that she wanted to end it all once and for all, and so she took the pills and drank alcohol and thought about the fact that she just couldn't take the constant taunts anymore. But in this life, and there was nothing to regret, but after tears in her eyes, the girl thought about the fact that she did not even have anyone to say goodbye to before her death, because there was not a single person who would regret her departure. And she did not understand how it came to this. For she was born the only princess of their kingdom, and her life any man would envy. And so the girl thought that maybe if she hadn't married this man, she could have been happy. But there was no point in talking about it now, because it was impossible to turn back time. And so nothing could be changed, and just with tears in her eyes, she said goodbye to this world. And in her last moment remembered that 3 years ago, the reforms in national policy, which King Lockround had undertaken, had failed. And the king was unable to contain the general chaos and bring order to the country, and died suddenly, and as a result, the flames of the people's revolt grew stronger and stronger every day, and they threatened that the royal family should atone for their sins only with their lives. Eventually, the rebels stormed the castle and captured the rest of the ruling family. It was a debt-ridden royal family, and then the protagonist, shaking with fear, clung closer to her mother and hugging her said that it was really very scary because she was facing imminent death. But at that moment, the girl found out that Winter Bloomend needed a title because he was the Duke's illegitimate child and was born to a common stranger. And although he was the eldest son of the family, because of the impure blood flowing in his veins, the likelihood of inheriting the title of Duke was extremely low, and the only thing he had was the talent to earn and save money. And as a result, since there were only 2 ways to get a title in their kingdom of Lockround, it was either to get it from their father by inheritance or get married. That was the only way left for Winter Bloomend, and that was to marry a girl from the royal family. And he invested a fortune to repay the royal family. And in return, he demanded marriage to the princess, and they were eventually pronounced a married couple at the ceremony. And then the protagonist stood at the altar while the man put the ring on her and thought that she didn't expect Winter Bloomend to turn out to be such a gorgeous man, and thought about the fact that she never thought she would fall in love at first sight with the man who became her husband. It was Violetta, the main character and part-time princess of Lockdown. And then the girl looked at Winter Bloomend and wondered if he liked her as much as she liked the man. And then she thought that the man was quite mature and much more intelligent than they said he was. In the end, the protagonist awkwardly took Winter Bloomend's hand with a smile and said that when they first met, the girl realized just how lucky she was. But the man looked shocked at her and simply remained silent, not knowing what to say to something like that. But at that moment, their conversation was interrupted by Ash Lawrence, Violetta's older brother and also the prince, who looked around at everyone present and said that Bloomend had paid $24 million for his wedding to Princess Winter. And it was thanks to this man that most of the royal family's debt had been paid off. But that's not all the young man had to say as he apologized for putting the royal family in danger. And in proof of the words, he wished to announce that the royal power would be reduced and that all powers of government would devolve upon Parliament. After which the last thing he added was to announce with a smile that the Lawrence family was relinquishing all their titles. And then the excited protagonist and also everyone present who heard it literally could not believe what the young man had just said. After all, everyone knew very well that this marriage was the last hope for Winter Bloomend to get the title of Duke. And that meant that all his plans had collapsed. And all these people mocked Winter, realizing that such a talented businessman had fallen for a wedding scam. And it appears that a guy of dubious origin was humiliated in his attempts to gain power. But then the man angrily shook the glass to such an extent that it cracked and then broke the grip of the protagonist and immediately went away. And she's just excited watching this picture. I literally couldn't believe it turned out this way. While excited aristocrats gathered around her brother, praising the young man, saying that he had made a truly wonderful decision, because the royal family was the first to give up their privileges, and they will hope that the example set by the royal family will be the beginning of a brighter future. And the protagonist was surrounded by insanely disgruntled people who blamed the girl and her family for such antics. After all, they looked down on Winter Bloomend's family, and Grab, the main character, demanded that her family return all the money that the man had paid, and she was just in tears, not realizing what to do. And it was a similar statement by Ash Lawrence that started the future tragedy. As a result, 3 years later in the manor of Winter Bloomend, excited girl ran up to the man and the maids that followed her in every possible way asked the mistress to return to his bedroom and not to do rash actions. But the main character was not even going to do that, and so she ran up to her husband and excitedly asked him to stay at least one more day because her mother was having a party today, and she really wanted Winter Bloomend to go to the party with her. But grudgingly, the man informed her that this time he would be back in a week, and so informed her that if Violetta wanted it so badly, she had to go alone, or else say she was ill. But the excited girl said that it was not as simple as Winter Bloomend thought, and that she would not have dared to ask for something like that otherwise. But the disgruntled man only asked if Violetta realized how much money Violetta was spending on her upkeep, and then ordered the girl not to waste his time at all. And the excited servants, who were looking at this picture, were whispering about who should stop Violet Lawrence. After which the man, moving away from the protagonist, asked if she even remembered that he had spent $24 million to buy the title the girl was born with. Then informed him that if the protagonist remembered it, she had one very simple choice. Either she had to pay him back all the money she had spent, or she had to give him the title. Then informed him that if Violetta was unable to do either of those things, she was to keep quiet and just stay out of his way, and preferably out of sight. But the excited girl only said that it would not make any difference to Winter Bloomend if he stayed only 24 hours, and asked him to make concessions to her at least this time, but was only confronted with the man's contemptuous, haughty stare, and then Violetta realized she should have just backed off. In the end, so in past 3 years since the nightmarish wedding ceremony, and sometimes the girl felt like a ghost, and even wondered if this man would come to her funeral if she died. As a result, a little later, Violetta met with the family doctor and the man. Having examined the protagonist, reported that she had absolutely no abnormalities, but the girl only excitedly reported that she had been tormented by headaches for a long time. To which the doctor calmly remarked that he was well aware that the girl had grown up in a hothouse when she was a princess, but he urged her to stop faking it. And the agitated protagonist, under the laughter of her maids, tried to convince the doctor that she was really very bad, because her headache was so bad that it was even hard for her to get up. But the doctor only looked at her unhappily and said that the girl should have stopped lying so brazenly a long time ago, because she had to get up and get ready, and such behavior was just a bad habit. And the doctor said that if the girl called him again, he would have no choice but to tell the elder mistress. And then when the doctor came out, the maids told Violet Lawrence that she had to hurry up and get ready to leave. And she only excitedly said that in that case, if the doctor said she was well, she would go to her husband's mother's house for the evening. And Violetta got out of the carriage. And looking at this, the excited servants who were looking at her literally could not believe what had happened to their mistress's hair. But after the girl with a haughty smile said that Violetta wanted to change something in her image, and so she cut off her hair, but afterwards said that it was even better for them, because they were madly tired of dealing with Violetta Lawrence's long hair, so it will make their job a lot easier. And the main character that perfectly heard these conversations only thought about the fact that she really did not want to go to this party, because even if she comes, there will be no place for her. And the surroundings always will ignore her. However, to miss this party, she also could not miss it. A little later, she was interrupted from her musings by a woman who was the Duchess and Winter's foster mother, and his brother Dave, who was the heir to the family. And the excited woman inquired why Violet was late and asked if the girl was feeling ill again. After that, she said that she was very worried about the fact that the protagonist is constantly sick, and asked what the doctor told her. And the worried girl tried to say that, in fact, she was fine. But at that moment, her doctor appeared out of nowhere and told her that the younger mistress had come after all, then shouted that he was really right, and it meant that the protagonist was constantly faking all these diseases. And the agitated girl watched her as they all discussed her and talked about the fact that apparently Violet Lawrence did not want to attend her spouse's parents' party so badly that she had just pretended to be ill, and they thought her unconscionable. But at that moment, the Duchess smilingly informed that she held no grudge against Violet Lawrence, for she was a princess, and it was likely that to her, even a small illness would seem great. But the other noblewoman only grudgingly informed the Duchess that she had been too soft on such a rogue of the Lawrence family, and the Duchess should have been stricter. And then the protagonist in tears thought about the fact that the serene life of a happy princess long ago ended, and it was her sad story that became a frequent subject for gossip and rumors among the aristocrats. And so she stood on the sidelines just waiting for the party to end. But at that moment, suddenly she was called, and it was all Mr. Dave, who with a smile looked at the main character, stated that as he expected, the girl was really always alone and wondered whether his brother again left for work and did not pay attention to her. But the next moment, seeing that the girl does not go to talk to him, he took off his scarf and tied it around the neck of the protagonist, saying that he thought that the others were too strict towards Violet Lawrence because all the time talking and defaming her name. So he said that the main character was really very lonely and there was no one to take care of her, and it was really painful for him to look at it. Then he said that he would like to invite Violetta Lawrence to have a drink with him, and he would like to brighten up the loneliness of this girl. I asked her not to worry about the consequences since no one would know, although in her position she had nothing to lose anyway. But the agitated girl pushed the man back and asked him to not worry so much about her. But Dave calmly told the protagonist that she apparently didn't understand how the world worked, and she should have behaved smarter, especially since his brother is also often not at home. And the excited girl could not stand such a thing, and immediately turned around and ran away, and looked after her. Dave only thought about the fact that she would definitely regret her choice. And then the shocked and in tears protagonist running away, thinking that it was really terrible, because the heir of a noble family turned out to be a lecher who thought of molesting his own daughter-in-law, and no one would believe it, and then thought that it did not even make sense, because there was no man who just wanted to listen to her. Finally, lying on her bed, she thought about how she was tired of it all, and she just couldn't take the perpetual humiliation any longer. And so she said goodbye to everyone, and at the end, she remembered her happy past. And also in contrast, her like hell of a married life. And also she said goodbye to her spouse, Winter. But finally, in the morning, the girl woke up, and while in bed, she thought that she had no heavy thoughts and her head was light as well as her whole body. And she felt an incredible warmth. So she thought that she was in paradise, and realized that if she had known that her death was so sweet, she would have died 3 years ago. And with a smile turned around to think that she was feeling really good. But then she heard her voice. And so she got up immediately and started to look around, and noticed that the body she was in didn't belong to her, and she didn't understand what had happened to her. And at this time, the body of Violet Lawrence was on her bed, and with tears in her eyes began to move, which showed that the girl was not dead. Eventually at this time, the protagonist, looking around herself, reflected that she was a tall, broad-shouldered man with tar-black hair and ashy eyes and a wild look. But at the same time, she had delicate aristocratic features, and she was excited and didn't understand how she could become Winter, and thought she might be crazy. But at that moment, an assistant came into the room excitedly and called Winter Bloomend, informing him that the man with whom they had a meeting had already appeared, and that the man needed to change his clothes immediately. But seeing his surprised reaction, the secretary asked why Winter Bloomend was now frozen in place, for they had very little time, and especially since the man had surprisingly slept for a long time today. It was Secretary Kale who stepped closer to Winter Bloomend's bed to put his things down and informed him that he should have kept to formal style, as this was a very important meeting. And the excited protagonist only thanked the man. But Secretary Kale looked at his boss in surprise and wondered, why did he start talking like that? He was too polite. But afterwards he thought that apparently Winter Bloomend was trying to speak according to etiquette, or he assumed that the man had had too much to drink. But the protagonist in Winter Bloomend's body only asked excitedly what had happened last night. And the secretary reported that when discussing the supply of coffee beans, the aristocrat tried to raise the price by 30 coins per gram. And so, unable to bear such insolence, Winter Bloomend simply went ballistic. But after scrutinizing Winter Bloomend, Secretary Kale inquired as to the reason he hadn't changed his clothes and asked him to hurry. Violetta thought that even though she was now in her husband's body, she still felt uncomfortable undressing in front of another man. After which Winter Bloomend also asked Secretary Kale to help with tying his tie. But the shocked secretary excitedly asked what had happened to Winter, for he was not like himself. And Secretary Kale was already beginning to worry about his master. But in the end, a little while later, fixing his tie, Secretary Kale asked Winter Bloomend to return to his old way of speaking, because venting his emotions through swearing wasn't so bad. And then he said that he was actually more surprised that Winter Bloomend had asked for his help, because that was insanely rare. And then informed him that the meeting was to take place now. And even if the bastard got on his nerves, Kale asked that Winter Bloomend not turn the table over like last time, and keep his temper in check. And then the agitated protagonist in a man's body just wondered if her spouse was that emotional. Violetta thought that perhaps she had gone mad, and that all that had happened might be an illusion created by her sick imagination. Violetta thought that perhaps she had gone mad, and all that had happened might be just an illusion created by her sick imagination. But finally, walking into the negotiating room, Violetta realized that no matter how much she could ignore this contract, she simply couldn't, and so she had to do everything in her power, and decided that she should put her thoughts aside and try to remain calm, as Secretary Cale had recommended. Finally, at this moment, the disgruntled aristocrat looked at Winter Bloomend and said that he would only sell the coffee bean at this price, which was 30 coins more, and this was his final opinion. But a flustered Winter Bloomend only said that they had previously negotiated a different price, and they just might not be able to afford it. But the disgruntled men only wondered what Winter Bloomend was talking about, for he should not have pretended that it was a lot of money to him, for the man's hotel chain was more prosperous than ever. Then Violetta thought that her husband's business must have prospered, and he had recovered his capital. But then she realized that it was probably impossible, for otherwise Winter Bloomend would not have behaved in this way towards her, and wondered if everything in this world and what was happening to her now was just her imagination. For the girl had always felt guilty about Winter, because by marrying her he had lost a lot, and so every time the man came home, and she tried to brighten his return with her smile. But then the disgruntled merchant said that at the price Winter Bloomend was offering him, he couldn't even pay all the children who worked for him. And then the agitated man inquired, was it really true that the children were now working and getting nothing? And when he heard something like this, he immediately prepared to put his seal and sign the price the merchant was offering. But at this moment intervened an excited secretary who informed the merchant that he was madly sorry, but Mr. Winter Bloomend had gone overboard with alcohol yesterday and therefore was not feeling well, and then took the man away and inquired excitedly as to the reason why Winter Bloomend was acting as he was, and whether he had not yet sobered up. Then suggested that perhaps the man was still affected by his past of hard labor as a servant, but explained that the peddler was a miser and that he would not pay any of the money to the children. After all, this man only wanted to continue living off Winter Bloomend. And then, thinking about this thought, Winter Bloomend wondered what he would do if he were in a normal state and not hungover. And a flustered Secretary Hale Lee said it was the first time she'd ever seen Winter Bloomend so affected by alcohol, but replied that last time the guy flipped that as soon as the price increase was discussed, and for that reason, and Secretary Cale had to calm the man down and set up a new meeting. And then sitting down in her seat, Violetta wondered if she really should have turned the table over as her husband would have done if he were in this body. After which, excitedly, she looked around the table and tried to lift it, for she really couldn't believe that her husband's body was capable of it. But when she was convinced, she saw the madly frightened merchant shaking with fear and looking at Winter Bloomend. And then seeing this man, Violetta realized that she just couldn't do that to him, for she would never do such a thing. And then picking up Winter Bloomend's papers, he thought that Violet Lawrence's soul was now in this body, and so she must behave accordingly. And for that reason indicated that she would like to start negotiations from the beginning. Whereupon Winter Bloomend entered his image and indicated that he would like to resolve the issue through dialogue, and they would discuss the issue until both sides were satisfied. After which Violetta thought that turning the table and intimidating the other person was her husband's method. However, he was not here and now, so her methods would be different, because she's had to live under years of human criticism and ridicule, and tolerating it is what the protagonist does best, and she'll treat it as just another test she has to endure. After which I hold out the documents to the merchant Winter Bloomend, said that they would read the terms of the contract from the beginning, and they'll work until they come to an agreement or one of them gets tired and gives in to the other. In the end, around the same time, the maids heard the sound of the bell from the room of the main character and did not want to go to her because they did not want to hear how this girl again pretended to be sick. But in the end, Winter Bloomend, being in the body of Violet Lawrence, could not get any answer, and so the girl had to go down the stairs on her own. She looked at the doctor carefully and demanded that the man examine her urgently because she had no time to talk, but she had a huge headache and demanded that the man find out what the problem was. But he only calmly and lazily looked at Violet Lawrence and said that they had already talked about it yesterday and that the girl was all right. But she asked him unhappily why he had said something like that, for she felt really awful. And then the man checked Violet Lawrence's pulse, only to reflect that he was too busy and had no desire to listen to the girl's pretense. And so he exhaled unhappily and reported that Violetta was definitely normal, and inquired as to how long the lady would continue to feign illness. But at that moment, the girl could not stand it. She grabbed the man and pulled him to her and looked at him with a fierce look, informing him that today she had to sign a contract, so the doctor had to stop badgering her and do his job. And the man only wondered excitedly that now this behavior reminded him insanely strongly of their Mr. Winter Bloomend. Then the girl opened the safe and threw the money in the doctor's face and wondered if it would be enough for the doctor to finally realize what he had to do. And then the excited man said that he had to cure the lady. And then Violetta looked at the doctor with contempt and said that he was absolutely right, because she had to go to the capital. So the doctor had to move and finally cure her, because if she fainted, her husband would surely fire the doctor. Then she turned around unhappily and thought that she would fire this man as soon as she returned to her body, because he didn't deserve this position. And the doctor who looked at Violet Lawrence only wondered what had happened to their master, who valued money so much, and yet gave the password to the safe to the younger mistress, because it was literally unthinkable. And he did not understand what had changed in the head of the younger mistress to behave so arrogantly, because the woman used to live very quietly regardless of the relations of others and suddenly began to behave like her husband. But at that moment, Violetta Lawrence began to have severe headaches again. And then an excited servant came running up to her and asked what could be done to help. But Violetta calmly said that all she needed was coffee and as hot as possible. After which everyone watched Violetta drinking coffee, and Philip wondered if their mistress's taste preferences had become exactly the same as Winter Bloomend's, which surprised them. But the next moment the girl rose from her seat, and with a displeased look at all present, reminded them that she had ordered the doctor to cure her, so he must find some medicine as soon as possible, and ordered Philip to go to the station and buy her tickets for the next train. And eventually, left alone, Winter Bloomend pondered why all the servants had behaved so strangely to him while he was in the body of his wife, then wondered what was going on with that woman. But looking around the room, he thought his wife was a refined princess, but in fact her lifestyle was not much different from his. And unhappily fixing his hair, he realized that there could be no mistake, because he had switched bodies with his wife, and he wasn't even surprised. So this outcome was still good enough, compared to indentured labor in a Lilliputian village as a giant slave, or compared to a situation where he would be a stolen mage and subjected to gruesome experiences. But after a moment's discontent, he thought that there were plenty of people who held grudges against him. And touching the hair that now belonged to him, Winter Bloomend thought that it had been a long time since Violetta had cut it off. For a year ago in the winter, Violetta smiled with joyful delight that her husband would stay at home for 4 whole days and they could spend some wonderful evenings. But Winter Bloomend calmly inquired to the protagonist, so pleased with such news. But the girl calmly stated that it was indeed very happy, and wondered what her husband thought of her hair, for she thought it was too long and wondered if she should cut it off, for perhaps Winter Bloomend would like it better. But he only coldly said that Violetta could do as she pleased, for he had nothing to do with it, and he thought that Violetta could do as she wished, for he had no right to interfere and decide for her. But when he looked at her, he saw the main character's distraught face and just decided to run away from the situation. So he went to work. After that, Winter Bloomend thought about the fact that after such a conversation, Violetta did not cut her hair, so he was sure that the girl changed her mind. But from that day disappeared strange questions to which Winter Bloomend did not understand how to answer so that to leave his wife satisfied. But eventually, a little later, turning to Violet Lawrence, the maid said that she had brought the doctor's medicine and that they would prepare a carriage for Violet to go to the station in the evening. But the protagonist only calmly drank her medicine and told the girl that she could leave. Then Winter Bloomend thought that apparently the answer he had given Violet Lawrence that time might not have pleased her. But he thinks back to that day only to wonder what the problem might have been. After which he lay down and happily on the bed, and Winter Bloomend in Violetta's body reflected that the more he thought about this girl, the less he understood her. But in the end, in the morning, Secretary Kell came into Winter Bloomend's office and said hello, that the man could still lie down. Also because he had done really well in the last 2 days, and yesterday he was simply irresistible. Then reported that he really could not believe that the man would be able to hold that merchant until he gave up and asked when his master had had time to learn Sagar ethics, since the guy had always dozed off in lessons on the rules of court behavior. So Secretary Kell was very surprised. As a result, during the meeting with the merchant, Winter Bloomend decided to smoke a cigar. And the man across the street was really very surprised, because the anonymous stranger knew how to smoke properly. But then a guy looked at the men across from him with all seriousness and said that good sitters are always accompanied by good wine. So he asked Secretary Cale to bring 10 bottles, for they had a really long conversation ahead of them. And at such words, the merchant was shocked. But remembering this, Secretary Cale reported with admiration that it was really incredible to hold the merchant for a whole 48 hours. But he did manage to negotiate a very favorable contract. Whereupon Secretary Cale reported that the sight of that fleeing aristocrat was really amazing, and Secretary Cale was insanely happy from just remembering it. And at that moment, the embarrassed man reflected that he had done it after all. The protagonist inside this body reflected that she had never expected that her knowledge of court etiquette would ever come in handy. Then she thought that if this was the life of a madman, she would like to spend eternity in this state. So she prayed that God would make it so that she would never wake up from this dream. But at that moment, Secretary Cale reported that while Winter Bloomend was asleep, a telegram had arrived from the lady. And without even thinking, he wondered if it was a telegram from his mother. After which Violetta immediately realized that she had probably spoken too nicely about this woman. But Secretary Hale would pretend not to notice, and calmly reported that the lady had informed him that Winter Bloomend's wife had cut her hair, and therefore requested that Winter Bloomend should remember to compliment her. And Secretary Cale himself had only thought of, why did the younger mistress so strongly not want to see Winter Bloomend's parents? After all, everyone treated her very well. But at this moment, to the surprise of Secretary Hale, Winter Bloomend, Lai reported that he was absolutely not interested. Then she thought that her husband's family had never treated her well. At family gatherings, they talked only about work and paid no attention to the girl. And she constantly had to endure all those scornful looks and mocking whispers and unfair accusations. But she thought it unlikely that Winter Bloomend knew about it. But even if he had, Violetta doubted that the man would have taken her side. Then she remembered all the moments associated with Winter and thought that she was to blame for all her husband's troubles, and understood perfectly well why Winter Bloomend didn't care about her. And so in time, the protagonist had long since given up hope, and so she calmly told Secretary Cale that she wasn't interested in what he was doing with his wife. But the next moment there was a noise, and the excited servants tried to stop the younger mistress, for she was determined to break into the room where Winter Bloomend was now. And then the insanely shocked protagonist in the body of Winter Bloomend did not realize that now, when her real body enters, she will return from this dream. And she realized that she obviously didn't want that. And Winter Bloomend, in the body of Violet Lawrence, tried his best to get into this office, which he succeeded in doing. And so as soon as Violetta was inside, she ordered everyone out of the room, because she needed to have a serious talk with her husband alone. And Violetta, being in the body of a man, literally did not understand what conversation awaited her. Finally, when everyone had left the office, Secretary Hale looked at the agitated Philip and wondered what had happened to him, for he was breathing heavily. And the guy only reported that the younger mistress immediately jumped out of the carriage without even waiting for it to stop. And therefore he was madly frightened, because the girl clearly should not be so much overexertion. But Violet Lawrence didn't seem to care at all. Philip then reported that when the younger mistress woke up, she said she had to see Winter immediately. But after looking around, he asked why they were here and where Violetta was now. And the excited Secretary Cale only tried to explain somehow, but he realized that usually Violetta was very calm and restrained. But suddenly she was not on a joke and did not understand what had happened to this girl. Finally, after closing the doors of Winter Bloomend and Violet's body, Lawrence looked at his own body, where the protagonist was now, and said that he had been absolutely right when he thought that they had exchanged bodies, and asked the protagonist what she had done. But the excited girl only said that she had done absolutely nothing and did not know why it had happened. Then looking around, Winter Bloomend went to his body and wondered what had happened here, and why his body was now emitting such an acrid cigar odor, and wondered what Violetta had done with this body. But the next moment, the two of them had a very bad headache, so bad that they immediately fell to the floor, unable to bear it. And when they opened their eyes, Winter Bloomend realized that when they touched each other, they had returned to their bodies at the same moment. And then the man looked around his body more contentedly and thought that it was finally over. And the protagonist looked at her hands and sadly stated that her soul had returned to her body. And it wasn't the ravings of a madman or a dream, it was real. Then with shaking hands, Violetta realized that now she would have to live again as before and endure all those scornful looks. but she wanted so much to get out of this hell. But the next moment she heard the voice of Winter Bloomond, who turned to Violetta and asked if she had listened to him at all. After which he asked that the protagonist not be silent and just talk to him. And then the excited girl wondered if she really wanted to be talked to, and so she turned her gaze to the man who asked what had happened, implying the contract the girl had made. And then the agitated protagonist realized that Winter Bloomond was not at all interested in her opinion about this situation, because even at such a moment, the man was only thinking about money, and she was just stupid if she hoped that they could have a normal conversation. But Winter Bloomond calmly explained that she was asking something like that because the contract problem had been resolved very well, even though it was strange. And while he was coming up here in the body of the protagonist, he heard that she was able to get a much better deal, and wondered how that miser had ever gotten her a price. And walking further across the room stated that that man was actually not so simple. And the flustered protagonist that watched it only wondered if for some reason those words unexpectedly sounded like a compliment, even though she knew it couldn't be. And it was pointless to hope. But still, such attention made her embarrassed. And she thought that maybe her husband would be more attentive to her, and so she reported that nothing serious had happened, but then asked Winter Bloomond if he had any idea why they had switched bodies. But he reported that he really had no idea. She ordered herself to calm down because she was so excited that they hadn't talked for a long time and thought that she had to continue the conversation somehow. But after looking at her husband's eyes, she remembered that he had gray eyes and that it was the mark of a family that had emigrated to the kingdoms long ago. And it was said that among these people were those gifted with magic. And so the excited girl reported that Winter Bloomond was of Canic descent. And so she thought that perhaps the cause of all this was related to his lineage. But the man suddenly looked at the protagonist in a frenzy and wondered if Violetta had really just said that if a man was born of a foreign woman, it meant that he was a sorcerer. And the princess was now blaming his foul blood for everything that happened. But the madly frightened girl only tried to explain that she didn't mean it at all and was really shocked by such an assumption, informing that she really didn't mean to insult the man. But he calmly declared that Violetta might not have been pretending. And it was not the first time he had heard humiliation from noble lords. And so such a thing was to be expected from a princess. But the protagonist only shook with horror and said that her family had never been like this, and cried out in despair that she really thought Winter Bloomond knew nothing about the Canic family, and that's why she'd said it. Then she wondered why everything always turned out so badly, for as soon as she tried to make a step towards the young man, he immediately pushed her away. And so she shook hysterically and tried to explain that it was not like that and she did not mean to offend Winter Bloomond in any way. And then he looked excitedly at the girl. The guy only thought that apparently he was too rude and admitted that it was really difficult for him to have conversations with his wife because she often starts crying. And so he rose from his seat and immediately drew the protagonist close to him, while the excited girl only shouted and begged Winter Bloomond to stop. But eventually, the servants also noticed this cry, and afterward heard the creaking of the doors, which opened, and immediately Secretary Kale turned excitedly to Winter Bloomond and inquired why they had been talking so long. But in shock, he noticed that his master was now holding his consort in his arms, whereupon Winter calmly informed the girl that it didn't matter whether he was a descendant of a sorcerer or not, as the girl was to forget about it. When he was in her body, he realized that the girl was a bit of a mess. She couldn't imagine how she could live in that body, but she was excited to tell him that it wasn't that bad and that she could walk safely. But the next moment, he threw the girl on his bed and, taking off her shoes, demanded to lie down and rest. But the disgruntled protagonist said that this was the master's room and she could not be here, so she asked to go to her room. But he only calmly said that this was impossible, as his room was the most comfortable of all in the house, and then demanded that Violetta should stay here and rest while he was in the office. Then he looked carefully at the girl and asked what was happening to her body, because while he was on his way here, he felt that he was dying, because Violetta's body was as heavy as a stone. He thought that Winter Bloomond was so ill in his wife's body that he had never felt such a thing even after the beatings he had received when he was working as a servant. And so he wondered unhappily how the girl could live in such a state. But she excitedly said that everything was really normal. But she noticed that she felt a little better and realized that she had drunk some good medicine. But the disgruntled Winter Bloomond wondered if Violetta really thought her condition had improved and therefore looked at her unhappily and ordered her not to leave this room and just lie there and wait for the doctor. Then he turned to his secretary and demanded that he call a good doctor and pick up some comfortable woman's clothes after which he went at once to the office, and the joyous secretary, who was excitedly inquiring whether his master was still keeping up the gentlemanly manner. But after the man was only dissatisfied, he demanded that Secretary Cale did not waste time talking and call the doctor. And then he excitedly realized that apparently the winter had become the same after all. And the protagonist that was there and watched this picture from the side only thought about the fact that they still could not talk normally. In the end, when the doctor came and examined the girl, he sadly stated that Violetta's body was in a terrible state and she had obvious heart problems, and asked how long the protagonist had been taking the medicine. After which the doctor said that these medications had been discontinued long ago because they caused severe headaches. So he said that he would prescribe new medications for Violet Lawrence to take. After which he discontentedly inquired who could prescribe such medicines to Violet Lawrence, for it was not forgivable, and discontentedly inquired whether the girl had been prescribed these pills by someone with the qualifications of a doctor. But in the end, after all she had heard, the protagonist began to rise from her seat and thought she was greatly relieved when she learned that her disease was curable. But when the doctor noticed this, he immediately got excited and began to look over Violet Lawrence, informing her that she should have stayed in bed and there was no need to leave. But the girl calmly said that she wanted to move to another bedroom because she had better leave before the real owner of the room returned. But the doctor only excitedly said that it was strange enough to see spouses who avoided seeing each other. And the girl, thinking about his words, realized that all these changes had happened to her only because she had switched bodies with Winter for a while. But she could not be too hopeful, for this courtesy would not last long, and soon the man will forget about her again. That's what the main character thought, but the next morning when she went into her room, she literally could not believe her eyes, and inquired of the maids what was going on at all now, after which she was shocked, and wondered where all these clothes had come from and why it was all in her room now, and seemed to really not understand. But at the next moment, she was smilingly approached by the hotel maid Lulu, who asked Violetta Lawrence whether she liked the breakfast, and said that they had come here to help the girl with the selection of an outfit for dinner with her husband, and asked the main character to trust them. But she looked around at the maids in shock and literally couldn't believe what she was hearing because she had never dined with her husband at his request. Then she looked at the different dresses that were hanging in front of her and thought that all of them were really very luxurious and worried that maybe she shouldn't wear such dresses. But Lulu only smiled and said that Mr. Secretary Cale had carefully chosen the outfits for the main character because it was the first dinner with her husband in a long time. But the excited protagonist only thought that if she wore such an expensive dress, she'd be discussed. And her husband's mother will think her husband's spending too much money on Violet Lawrence if she's allowed herself to spend so much money, and think she's too brazen. And so the girl realized that in such a situation, the whole duchy would be outraged. She should have chosen something less flashy. So she reached out her hand for another outfit. But at that moment, she was approached by Lulu, who said that the dress that the mistress had recently seen would look great on her as it was perfect for the weather. But the girl only excitedly said that she wanted to choose another dress, to which the maid calmly remarked that she had evidently seen how much Violet Lawrence liked that outfit, for she had noticed it at once. And then the embarrassed girl said that in fact, this dress was her favorite color. And then she realized that in this place now, no one told her what to do, and she wanted to let herself relax a little. And so she chose this outfit. Then she sat down to have her hair done. And then the happy maid announced that Winter Bloomington was indeed the happiest man, because he was lucky to marry such a beautiful and kind girl. And the embarrassed protagonist thanked the woman for such words. But at this point, Violetta was embarrassed to say that she was worried about how much money her husband was spending on her, because she had heard that Winter Bloomington was on the verge of bankruptcy. Because when he married her, he paid her $24 million. But the maid reported that it was strange to hear something like that, for the president often bought a dress for his wife, as she had personally seen Secretary Cale bring them in great quantities. But the excited girl only thought that it could not be, for she had never received any dress from Winter Bloomington at any time, and she excitedly wondered who all those outfits really belonged to. Eventually, at the same time, Winter Bloomington excitedly looked at his watch and kept wondering for what reason Violetta was late. But not happy Secretary Cale reported that there were still 2 minutes left, and they delivered the clothes to Madam at only 10 o'clock. So it's no surprise that the girl is late. But the disgruntled man only wondered since when did Secretary Cale ever take his wife's side. Then wonder how could anyone spend so much time choosing another dull dress. At this point, the carriage arrived and Winter Bloomend looked at the carriage and thought that the princess with her refined taste had finally arrived and wondered what she would be wearing this time and what simple dress she would choose. But afterwards, he was shocked to watch the protagonist with his mouth open and literally could not believe what he saw. Because this time, the girl in front of him really looked insanely exquisite and beautiful like a flower that had just bloomed in early spring. And then she greeted the man, wondering what had happened to him and why he looked so surprised. But he only shocked to say that he was really surprised by the choice of dress of the main character, as she usually dressed too simply. And then the agitated girl tried to explain to the man the reasons for her behavior. But then she bowed her head sadly, realizing that it was really useless because Winter Bloomend wouldn't listen to her anyway. So she calmly said that they should go, as Winter Bloomend was too hungry now. And in the end, being in the restaurant, the girl admired the view from the window, and Winter Bloomend will calmly inform that if they had argued longer how exactly the main character will come here, they would have met the sunset. But she only grudgingly remarked that it was Winter Bloomend who had begun to urge her to take the elevator, for he thought her too weak to walk up and down the steps, and informed her that such a concern was over the line. But the man seemed absolutely not to consider in that way, and grudgingly reported that it was necessary. And then Violetta thought sadly that perhaps she really was a huge burden because of her health. But at that moment, Winter Bloomend looked at her carefully and told her that the protagonist was indeed right, and he had done a little research on his lineage, and he was indeed of the Canic family. But he found no mention of witchcraft. But there were records of body swapping with other people. But though he couldn't find any information on how it happens, the girl was indeed right. Afterwards, Winter Bloomend said that also while Violetta was in his body, she had managed to get the glitter contract, so he would like to thank her in some way. And the displaced protagonist only wondered, is he really going to thank his own spouse? After which wondered if Winter Bloomend again was acting like a businessman. But then she thought about what she really needed, because the only thing she wanted to ask for was to have her husband around for once. So she asked if he could take her to his dad's birthday party next month. But the disgruntled man, looking at Violetta Lawrence, said that she seemed to have misunderstood something, because his time was much more valuable than the time of the protagonist. And he wanted to express his gratitude to her with a valuable gift, and said that the girl could name anything. And then she awkwardly thought about the fact that even though they had been with their spouses for 3 years, they acted like strangers to each other. And so she calmly informed me that she didn't need any thanks, and that it was enough to know that everything had ended well. But the madly angry man only said that the girl was behaving as usual again, and demanded that if she didn't like something, she should say so directly, for he did not like to see her displeased face. But she only reflected that she wanted to ask the man something, and asked if he would have come to her funeral if she had died. And then the shocked man asked, did the protagonist really have such thoughts? And she calmly nodded her head, saying that she thought it would be better to end her life than to continue living like this. And then they fairly slammed the table. The man inquired why she was talking such nonsense. And then I wondered if the girl even realized what kind of life he lived, because she'd never been beaten, forced to work, or locked up. She was also never humiliated and never had to go hungry. But in the end, he said none of this and only laughed disgruntledly, inquiring whether his wife was now trying to threaten him with her death. But the girl calmly looked at the man and said that she was just asking, though she wondered if it really didn't make sense. But looking earnestly at the man in front of her, she wondered if Winter Bloomend would spare a whole day of his precious time for her, and then thought that the man would not spend a day on her. In the end, unable to bear such a thing, Winter Bloomend immediately got up from his seat and did not even pay attention to Secretary Kale, who had approached him, and so simply pushed him away with such force that the man immediately dropped all his papers. Then the excited secretary looked at his master and wondered where he was going and whether he was really going to leave his mistress alone. But the man did not react in any way, and then the girl thought that Winter Blooming had left without a word to her, and that this dinner had left them both with mixed feelings. In the end, a little later, the protagonist stood at the window, and then she was approached by the excited maids, who said that the day was already going towards sunset, and asked if the girl wanted to return to the manor. But she just calmly said that apparently the maids were very tired serving her, and said that she was well aware that the time was really late, and therefore she would be returning. But at that moment, she saw a familiar girl who happily called the protagonist to greet her. It was Ariella Lorenzo, Violetta's cousin, and a famous actress. And then the main character saw her, literally could not believe her eyes. And the happy girl said that she had not seen Violet Lawrence for a long time. then said that she works very hard every day. She had a lot of worries. And apparently the protagonist has been sitting at home all this time. And so Ariella suggested that she should look in the capital more often, but the protagonist calmly informed her that she would think about it, and that getting out of the house was not so bad. But at that moment, Ariella calmly said that she sometimes envied Violetta Lawrence immensely, because she would also like to get married as soon as possible and give up her routine and live a life of anxiety and floristry. And the protagonist only smilingly said that she hoped that everything would work out for Ariel. But at that moment, the girl suddenly said that she had seen Winter Bloomend and thought he was a nice man, because Ariella often met the man at the stadium, and because Ariella also had to think about earning money since she was a child. They found common ground very easily. But after Ariel, with a wicked smile, said that she had forgotten that Violet Lawrence did not like such a sport, for she thought it wild. But the protagonist calmly reported that the case was completely different, because you can't find something interesting in a case if you don't know it personally. But Ariella calmly approached the protagonist and stated that the girl had not changed at all, because she still wore the same mask of indifference, and said with a smile that it was no surprise that her own husband was very tired of her. But the protagonist only wondered what Ariella meant by that. But the girl said quite calmly that the protagonist shouldn't pretend she hadn't noticed. And then Violetta realized that if she had been the same, she would have told this girl everything to her face. But remembers her spouse should you realize that her words did not care, after all, in the eyes of all these people. She is just an ignorant princess who grew up surrounded by luxury and wealth and can hardly understand ordinary people. So any objections of hers would be twaddle. And so she only reflected that she had an easier position if she were to be considered tedious, after which she wondered whether Ariella would believe her at all, if she knew that her life was not so good, or whether she too would regard her words as the whims of a princess. In the end, after a while, the protagonist was riding quietly in the carriage and asked if Ariella often stayed at the hotel, to which Lulu calmly stated that she had often seen the lady there, and the girl said that their hotels were the best of the best. And even traveling to other cities to perform, she always insisted on their branches. But in the next moment, the shocked woman thought that apparently the reason why the younger mistress didn't know about the existence of dresses was just that. But the protagonist, seeing her shock, calmly informed her that the question meant nothing and she just wanted to make sure. But then the woman excitedly reported that apparently the mistress has not managed to eat and offered to cook her something. But the girl calmly reported that she was not hungry, which very annoyed the maid Lulu. And then the protagonist thought that it was obvious that her husband was rarely at home. But she did not believe that this man would be the kind of man who would cheat. But she thought about the fact that Winter Blooming hated her so much that she was foolish to hope that he didn't have another woman on the side. And at that moment, Violetta realized that for some reason she didn't care who the man was dating. Eventually, a little later, when the protagonist was in bed, the maid Lulu came to her and brought her a cup of coffee, and reported that it seemed to her that if Violetta didn't want dinner, she could bring Mistress a dessert to make the protagonist feel better. Then, with a sad smile, looking at the main character, asked that the girl at least support a cup of coffee if she didn't want to drink it, because it was cold outside today and it would help to warm up. Then moved closer and told the protagonist that life didn't seem so hard when a man pissed. And if a person was so tired that there was a veil in front of the eyes, it was worth trying to drink a cup of coffee and the person would feel a little better. So she suggested that the girl try and inhale, because Lulu the maid really wanted the main character to feel a little better. And then awkwardly the girl confessed that she was really warm. And with tears in her eyes inhaling the smell of coffee, the girl wondered if it really did help her, and she liked the flavor. She looked at Lulu and wondered if she could be so brazen as to ask the woman to cook her dinner, since Lulu had said earlier that it might help her. And then the woman literally glowed and said that she would be happy to do something like that, and she would run to the chef and have him prepare it. Then she said that Turin was the cook who had made breakfast for her, and he was mad proud of the praise of the protagonist. Then the woman added that the girl should have gotten some rest now, and when dinner was ready, she would surely come back for her. And the protagonist only looked at such a kind woman with gratitude. In the end, the dinner went well because the food was insanely delicious. And also the protagonist was happy to watch the arguments between Turin and Lulu, who tried in every way to please the protagonist and asked to try their food. So the girl realized that she felt quite happy because even though it wasn't much, she finally had people who cared about her at least a little bit. And the dinner these people cooked gave her a sense of satiety she hadn't felt in a long time. And so when the girl returned to the room, she told Lulu that the woman was indeed right, and she was very grateful for the dinner she had made with the cook. Whereupon Poe inquired if her husband had returned, at which point the woman informed her that Winter had recently returned, although she had expected the man to be staying at the capital's main hotel. And then the protagonist immediately recalled the words of her cousin Ariel, who informed her that her husband was too tired of the protagonist. And at that moment, the girl resolutely rose from her seat and realized that she simply had to meet her husband now, for she no longer wanted to live the life of a tiresome man. But then the man was in his office, mashing everything around and scattering papers, remembering the words of the protagonist that she would rather die than live like this. After which he thought that he was really just a pathetic coward if he was afraid of such words of the protagonist, and wondered why he even made money in such a case, if the protagonist thought of him and their lives in such a way. But the next moment there was a knock on his room, and from behind the door came the calm and cold-blooded voice of the protagonist, who apologized for such a late visit and said that they urgently needed to talk. And then the man opened the door and at once looked at Violet Lawrence unhappily and inquired why she had come and what she was going to tell him this time. But the protagonist overcame her sadness at such behavior from Winter Bloom and calmly concentrated, then reported that no matter how much time passed, they would definitely not change. And she realized she couldn't live like that anymore. And so she looked at her ring for the last time and said that today she was finally convinced of her arguments and decided that they had to get a divorce. And then Winter Bloom thought about the fact that unlike him, who was illegitimate, his wife was a real aristocrat. She had a graceful posture that had been honed by years, a tight corset and a lush dress, and to this girl the life of a noble lady was as natural as being able to breathe. And this exquisite in every way princess was forced to marry a lowly stranger out of a sense of duty to the royal family. And so for all 3 years of Winter's life together, Bloom felt tremendous guilt and considered himself pathetic as he tried to buy the title and his ability to make money. But he had nothing to satisfy the princess, no title, no bloodlines, and not much money left. The only thing Winter Bloom could do was make enough money for the princess to live in luxury. It was for this reason that when he heard from his spouse that she wanted to end her existence, and also that she wanted a divorce, the agitated man just didn't understand how he would live if Violetta disappeared from his life. And so he calmly looked at the girl and said that in this case, they would just do as Violetta wished and could divorce at any time. And then the madly joyful protagonist literally could not believe her happiness, because she really did not count on the fact that the man would agree. But in the next moment, he maddeningly coldly looking at the protagonist informed that in that case, the girl would have to return all the money he had paid for this marriage. After that, he came closer to the protagonist and said that they had been married for 3 years, and therefore he would add interest to this amount, and it would be at least 27 million. But after coming even closer, he told her that Violetta had been a really wonderful wife over the years, and therefore he would forgive her the interest. After which he started to think about what else he had forgotten to add, but noticed that the protagonist had gotten too close to the wall, as she was very scared, and inquired whether he should count the money for when the girl was just lying in bed. But the next moment excitedly approached and grabbed her head to prevent Violetta from banging her head against the hard wall, and informed the protagonist that if she wanted a divorce, she'd have to try harder, and grudgingly inquired as to the reason Violetta told him something like that. And then the insanely discontented protagonist became angry for the first time and wondered why Winter Bloom was so angry, for she knew that marriage for Winter Bloom was a total loss. And so she thought that a man should want to get rid of a marriage that was causing him nothing but loss. And almost crying said that in that case, Winter Bloom should just divorce her and get rid of such a problem as she was. And Violetta promised that she would definitely pay him back, as she was ready to work even to death, even if she did not pay the full amount, and asked Winter Bloom if he would be satisfied with such conditions. But the man was literally furious and wondered why first Violetta started talking about divorce and now about work, and absolutely did not understand what happened to the main character. But she only asked with a sort of sad smile, as the man not yet realized what this was all about. But at that moment, her smile flew off her face, and she lowered her gaze to the floor and wondered why Winter Bloom hated her so much. But he only looked at the girl excitedly and wondered why she was saying such foolish things. Then with shaking hands, he couldn't believe that his wife was thinking all the time that he hated her. And so he got up the nerve to tell Violet Lawrence that he didn't hate her, and that's why he didn't want to divorce her either. After that, he thought excitedly that he could not understand where Violetta got such thoughts in her head, but angrily added that for the future the girl should remember that unless he himself wanted a divorce, no one would help the protagonist. And at that moment, it seemed to Winter Blumenthal that if he did not clasp his wife tightly in his arms, she would disappear. And so the man pondered anxiously as to what he should do. But the protagonist just calmly reported that she understood what Winter Blumenthal was trying to say, and he only angrily went into his room and demanded that his wife not bring up such a subject again. And the protagonist, who was left alone in the hallway just thinking about the fact that Winter Blumenthal was clearly a liar because he lied when he said he didn't hate her. As a result, a few days later, the heroine was riding on a train that led to her familiar home, where she lived with her husband's parents. And the excited girl reflected on the fact that when she talked to Winter, she realized one simple thing: she will not be able to divorce this man as long as money is involved in this case, and thought that she ought to ask her brother, for there was nothing she could do. And since her brother had received the money for her marriage, but had failed to keep his promise to Winter Blumenthal and left her in distress, he could help her now. And especially her brother was the only person whose help she could count on, since the guy's support was beginning to grow. And as long as the case didn't require monetary outlay, the man could help. That's why the protagonist wrote a letter and told her brother that she wanted a divorce, so she asked him to find some way to give Winter Blumenthal the title, and anything would do. And so it agitatedly pondered whether the telegram had already reached her. But at that moment, the voice of Winter Blumenthal broke up, who told the protagonist that she was madly surprising him, because he did not understand how the girl could sit all the way in the same position. But she only calmly said that she, too, wondered why Winter Blumenthal changed his posture so often, for he looked like a little child. But the man calmly said that unfortunately he could not help it, for he was uncomfortable sitting. And then Violetta reported that Winter Blumenthal was on his 7th glass of liquor and wondered if he'd been drinking too much. But he only calmly inquired, was it difficult for the princess to tolerate such unworthy behavior from her husband? But she only calmly reported that her father had died early because he drank too much, and she was worried sick about Winter Blumenthal's health. And he only asked excitedly and as if in disbelief, wasn't it about his indecent behavior? And then sadly, the protagonist confessed that she had never in her life considered Winter Blumenthal's behavior undeserving. And hearing about it, the man was really shocked and for some time could not believe her words. But after bowing his head as if ashamed, he said that he was really glad to hear something like that. Eventually, their train arrived and then they got off, but the protagonist stopped where she was and looked around carefully. And then an excited Winter Blumenthal inquired for what reason she was not going. But the girl calmly pointed to the girl who was selling flowers and said that she wanted the flowers as a reward for her contract with that man and the contract with the coffee beans. But a surprised Winter Blumenthal lay wondering if that was all his consort wanted to ask, for she could have asked for something more worthwhile. But the girl calmly said she didn't want anything else. She just liked the flowers. But men believe unhappily informed that he could buy flowers and his wife elsewhere, for even at their home, the flowers were much better in quality. But Violetta said that if they remembered the flowers, she would like to have them now, for the flowers they had at home were not a present. And such a conversation, Winter Blumenthal was very dissatisfied. But the protagonist kept her cool. But afterwards, she just looked at her husband with a smile, and he couldn't resist that face. And then the protagonist asked her husband to buy her flowers from that particular child. Eventually it happened, and the protagonist put the flowers in a vase and thought about the fact that it had been half a month since she had returned to the estate, and her husband was only home for a week after he left on some business. And then she carefully arranges the flower and remembers the moment Winter Blumenthal gave it to her. At that moment, the man calmly looked at the protagonist, stated that recently she began to smile more often, and he was strange to see that his wife became cheerful after the proposal for divorce. And the protagonist only thought over why her husband so did not want a divorce, because it cannot be that the man found any benefit in this marriage, because she did not see any benefit here. Finally, after a while, Violetta thought about the fact that today there was a celebration in honor of her husband's father's birthday, and her brother would also be there. So she decided that she should obviously discuss all the issues with Ash Lawrence. But the next moment, the voice of the maids excitedly rang out, who reported that her brother had come to see the younger mistress, and she only excitedly allowed him to enter. After which she immediately ran up to him and inquired if the lad had received her telegram. But the next moment she froze in shock and wondered why her brother was now with her spouse's mother. And at this point, the woman disgruntledly looked over the protagonist and informed her that her brother had confessed that the protagonist wanted a divorce. and she didn't understand why the girl so brazenly ignored the fact that they all cared about her. And then a shocked Violetta was disappointed to realize that she had hoped her brother would be the one to help her, and he was the last person she could turn to. Then, shaking with fear, she asked her brother why he had done this to her. But at that moment, she met his cold gaze, and the guy informed her that he was insanely disappointed at his sister because he didn't expect her to be so selfish. As a result, a year ago in the duchy, James, the current duke, was visited by the protagonist's brother, and then the agitated man inquired, did Ash really talk about the money provided by their son to marry the princess? But the protagonist's brother calmly reported that Winter Blumen had assigned this money to Violetta as a share of the estate, and the agitated man only reported that it was somehow strange to hide someone else's money. But Ash only asked if the Duke was sorry that the money was lying idle, and said that his sister didn't even know about the existence of the money and there shouldn't be any problems with its disappearance. And then said that Winter Blumen didn't seem to have much interest in his sister's estate, so they could just divide the money between them and no one would ever know. And then the excited Duchess only wondered what the bank would say, because someone might have blabbed. But the boy only wondered if the lady was really worried about it, but explained that he could easily cover up all traces with his influence, for it was just a matter of letting it go. So he had already taken care of everything. And so, addressing the Duke and Duchess, he asked if they were willing to cooperate with him. That's why the brother now looked at his sister unhappily and wondered how she could even think about divorce. After which he pondered whether his sister really wanted to deprive him of a precious source of income, because he had to make sure that the girl did not dare to even talk about something like that anymore. And the shaking and shocked protagonist literally didn't know what to answer. But at that moment, the Duchess, with a most disappointed and hurt face, informed Violetta that she had tried her best, and was not indulgent in spite of the fact that the girl had so brazenly lied about her illness. But the flustered protagonist only reflected that she had never lied. But at that moment, the woman angrily declared that Violetta could not act like a willful princess when they had so kindly accepted her into their family, and wondered what the protagonist was not satisfied with, and whether she was not satisfied with Winter Blumen and his lack of title. But the girl only wondered fearfully that that wasn't the reason at all, at which point the Duchess cried out that it was all her fault, since she hadn't been paying attention to the protagonist's behavior all this time, but informed that she didn't intend to take it anymore. And at that moment, the excited girl thought about the fact that she just couldn't live in this world anymore, and for the last time tried to justify herself by saying that her husband's title had nothing to do with it, and she didn't want a divorce because of it, because she just couldn't stand the constant humiliation any longer.